Welcome to One Foot in the Past. In tonight's programme, trouble in Torbay, in a battle for heritage survival. Simon Thurley descends into the chamber pot of London in search of a once great river. And Rain, Countess Spencer, celebrates the charm of Cheltenham and its historic spa water. This is the Paignton and Dartmouth Steam Railway in Devon, which runs between Paignton and Kingswear on the Dart Estuary. It's one of the most remarkable steam railways in the country, recapturing the halcyon days of the Great Western Railway. And this is the Torbay Cinema, formerly the Paignton Picture House, probably the oldest purpose-built cinema in Western Europe. Its origins go back as far as 1904. These two wonderful bits of history sit side by side in the centre of Paignton. The trouble is, the cinema's owned by the Steam Railway, which wants to shut it down. It's been called the Battle of the Buffs.
Well, the cinema's so special to the local people for a start, because I think everybody we know in this area above the age of 60 seems to met their husbands here or their wives.
It's our last surviving cinema. It has a magic. I could almost say that I'm in love with the building. It really has a magic, and when you go in and the lights are dim, I don't think you can capture that romance anywhere else.
But now the railway owners argue that to continue supporting the cinema jeopardises the future of the steam train, while the cinema enthusiasts believe that the railway planned to shut down the cinema from the moment they bought it.
We want to increase our station capacity here at Paignton, and the best way to do it, because our interest is so narrow, was to purchase that cinema, which was closing in 1987. We want a change of use from a cinema to a station terminal building, and all our passengers, some 300,000 plus, will go through there and out again each season.
The Steam Railway, I think, probably started off as a preservation group, but I now have the feeling that they've turned into a money-making, greedy business.
One of the main questions hanging over the Paignton Picture House is whether or not it can make enough money to survive as a cinema. The railway claims it will never make money. The cinema supporters argue it could.
It needs to be marketed because it needs to be treated as a tourist attraction, and it's not. At the moment, they're just opening the doors to the people in Paignton and perhaps a few holiday makers, etc. when they're here. And I honestly feel that that building is not reaching its full potential.
It's losing money hand over fist. Now I hear they're going to build a multi-screen complex 1 mile away that will totally finish it as a cinema.
The present building opened on March the 16th, 1914. Designed by local architects Hyams and Hobjon, it reflected the palatial look of a grand theatre.
We had a royal blue dress with yellow inserts pleats. And then we had to line up in the foyer. There was the doorman and the commissionaire. Everybody had to line up, and out come the hands like this. You had to be, and also the hair had to be smart.
This is the area of the cinema where the bettermost folks would have sat years ago. Many famous people have used this cinema, including Dame Agatha Christie. This is the seat that she used to use. The seat E10 was used by Tommy Cooper, the late lamented magician. And you look at the private boxes. The two-seater private box was used by Paris Singer and his one-time mistress, the dancer Isadora Duncan.
Well, there was a back row, and of course we had couples in there. And sometimes we had to go along and turf them out of the back row for that you got a bit too hot under the collar attitude.
It's almost impossible to overestimate the social significance of the Paignton Picture House. For most of its working life, it occupied a far more important place in people's lives than a modern cinema. This was where they could see and hear about national and world events.
The fateful hour of 11 has struck, and Britain's final warning to Hitler having been ignored, a state of war once more exists between Great Britain and Germany.
In those days, of course, newsreels would have been actually rushed from the processing works by dispatch rider to the nearest railway station, which would have been Paddington, and then that would have been sent by the Great Western Railway direct to our railway station next door to the cinema. So they would be fairly quick off the mark.
So, ironically, the relationship of steam and cinema, the very thing that now threatens to close the picture house, is an important part of its history. Now that relationship could transform the building. Architecturally, the cinema could be refurbished as a grand booking hall for the steam railway. If it was designed imaginatively, it could create, on a small scale, all the glamour and elegance of Grand Central Station in New York.
As I see it, as it's right on the main street, people will walk up those lovely steps, through those beautiful doors. They will then get their ticket, walk into the auditorium, the floor will be levelled, enjoy that beautiful ceiling. They'll be able to see the building, they'll be able to enjoy it. It'll be seen by a lot more people, and it'll be used every day.
But the railway plans for the cinema are likely to be rejected by English heritage. The cinema's top listed status, Grade 2 star, limits changes of use.
There are so few buildings of this genre surviving intact that it's rather more prescriptive than usual. And I would have judged that we are dealing here with a building whose latitude for change is relatively limited.
If you don't get your way, what will happen?
We should close it down and put it up for sale.
I'm hoping that that will never happen, that it won't be left to decay. And I cannot understand how people in heritage are letting this happen.
We need these facilities. We need to expand. I mean, even the local Chamber of Trade, who are supposed to support businesses, condemned us, said we don't need an extra platform. What they know about the business, I don't know. We're trying to do our best, help them, bring more people into the area, and they're fighting us.
I think listing will be considered in the medium to long term a help. I don't think at the moment it's considered a help. I think inevitably the railway company will think it's a liability. But I do really believe that if we're right, I think we are, about its rarity value in the national context, then in the medium to long term, the railway company might consider they had a real asset on their hands, and people might come flocking to see it in 50 years' time because it was the best preserved picture house in the country. In many respects, this ought to be a dream scenario, and at the moment it's a bit of a nightmare.
Certainly the mechanism to save buildings is failing the Paint and Picture House. In effect, the current listing slaps a stagnation order on the cinema, ensuring stalemate and leading to closure and slow decay. In a better world, a bolder solution will be embraced. The cinema is set to close its doors for the last time early next year. Peeping through the trees, almost succumbing to the undergrowth, sits what appears to be a modest 17th century cottage. In fact, this truly forgotten building was once of high social status. As recently as the First World War, the building still boasted an imposing presence. This is an early 17th century Assizes courthouse on the outskirts of Martley in Worcestershire. An old tree known as the Martley gibbet once stood conveniently close by for public hangings. 4 times a year, the Assizes judge would arrive to a rapturous reception from the locals. And here he enjoyed every convenience. Grand lodgings for himself upstairs, below the courtroom, and below that, a lockup for the accused. Since the early 1980s, the building has lain empty and exposed. This important ruin deserves better treatment. Ideas should be sent to Malvern Hills District Council, Malvern, Worcestershire. Almost every great city is founded on a great river. Paris has the Seine, Rome the Tiber, and London has the Thames. But once London was truly a Venice of the North, with several fine tributaries running into the Thames. But where have they all gone? Simon Thurley rediscovers the once majestic River Fleet.
All too often, looking at a map of London, the city seems to be completely flat. But in reality, London was built in the bottom of a valley, which rises up to 400 feet on either side. There are only a few places where you can appreciate this, and this is one of them, on the top of Hampstead Heath. From high spots like this, from Wembley and Crystal Palace, run the valleys of more than a score of tributaries that wend their way down to the River Thames. Today, they're nowhere to be seen, yet they exist, running beneath our feet, and it's possible, if you know where to look, to find them.
The greatest and the most interesting of London's lost rivers is the Fleet. Starting as a tiny stream in rural Hampstead, it was bustling with boats and barges by the time it reached the Thames. Even as late as the mid-19th century, sections of it were still above ground, winding around the backs of houses. 100 years before, it provided recreation for the young men of the capital, who'd strip off and plunge in. The Fleet still wells up in Hampstead today and trickles as a tiny stream between the Heath's famous ponds. But this is the river's last and only playground. The southernmost pond, it is sucked into the bowels of London, never to see the light of day again. As London expanded and lanes turned into roads and roads into high streets, the river was buried, enclosed in culverts, and the only clues to its former existence are in place names. But it's not just roads which exploited its riverbed. When London Underground was built, the river was diverted into drains so that the Metropolitan line could run along the river valley between King's Cross and Farringdon. Where water once flowed, today, tube trains trundle.
This is the final section of the Fleet, which runs from Farringdon Street down to the Thames at Blackfriars. The whole of its east side was excavated by the Museum of London in the 1980s. And from that, we know that in Roman times, it was over 90 yards wide. On the west, it rose steeply, but on the east, there were two small islands. And on one of these, William the Conqueror built a castle to subdue the Anglo-Saxons. We also know that from Roman times, the Fleet was spanned by bridges, over half a dozen of them by the 17th century. But today, only this one, Oban Viaduct, remains.
Londoners crowded along the riverbank, many relying on the Fleet for their livelihoods. Butchery was established on its banks from earliest times, and the bloody offcuts from this trade went straight into the river. It became filthy, and its water clogged with carcasses.
From 1342, the butchers of Smithfield, who still occupy the site today, were given permission to wash the entrails of dead animals in the Fleet. Ben Jonson, in the 17th century, said that banks ran with the grease and hair of measled hogs, the heads, puffs, entrails, and hides of dogs. And Jonathan Swift wrote, sweepings from butchers' stalls, dung, guts, and blood, drowned puppies, stinking sprats, all drenched in mud. Dead cats and turnip tops come tumbling down the flood.
Oddly enough, it was the Great Fire of 1666 which gave London the chance to clean up the Fleet. Fire completely obliterated the area around the river. And so, as part of his rebuilding programme, Sir Christopher Wren seized the opportunity to turn what had become an eyesore into a magnificent new waterway. The golden age of the River Fleet had arrived. Widened and lined with elegant brick wharves, it was to rival Venice's Grand Canal, with its bridges and expensive warehouses. Astonishingly, part of these warehouses still exist, embedded in the foundations of a building in Farringdon.
Down here, in the basement, we can find the last remnants of Sir Christopher Wren's great dream.
These once elegant brick vaults were built to store goods brought up Wren's Fleet Canal. But the cost of building wharfs was so high that hiring them was prohibitive, and in the end they became nothing more than mouldy white elephants.
The failure of Sir Christopher Wren's ambitious schemes led to the death knell of the river fleet. Acts of Parliament in 1734 and 1765 decreed that the canal should be arched over. The final indignity for the poor old river was to be turned into a sewer. It is today, in effect, the chamber pot of London.
Although the enclosure of the fleet led to the demolition of all Wren's bridges and walkways, the sewer today miraculously still holds some clues to the past.
The brickwork in this part of the sewer is 18th century, and I'm hoping just round this corner we're going to make rather an interesting discovery. Yes, these are the stones which are part of the original Fleet Bridge. Immediately above my head is Ludgate Circus, and amazingly some of the 18th century bridge still seems to be surviving.
This amateur sketch of the bridge,
done in 1840, was based on the memories of a 96-year-old man who remembered crossing it in his youth.
But the fleet wasn't to be tucked away quietly. In 1846 it exploded, bursting its banks and creating a tidal wave of sewage that swept away 3 poorhouses and dashed a steamboat against Blackfriars Bridge.
The sewer was of course rebuilt, but today sewage is carried off for treatment,
while storm relief drains empty rainwater into the Thames.
Behind me are the 2 outlet pipes that carry all that's left of the River Fleet into the Thames. Looking at them today, it's very hard to imagine the stinking torrent that had once formed such an important part of people's lives and businesses. It's also sad to think that what we could have had here was Sir Christopher Wren's magnificent canal, forming a wonderful shimmering vista in the centre of our capital city.
I'm here at Cardiff Castle twice a day, every day, to feed the peafowl and the poultry to make sure everything's okay. There are more castles in Wales than any country in Europe. This is the best. This one is the castle, not just in Wales, but in Europe. It's a jewel, isn't it? It's priceless. Look at this very room we're in now. Gosh. The visitors, they come here and they want to know about the castle. And of course, I love talking about the castle, so I give them the works. They're all, how can I put it, they're all surprised. It's the same thing all the time, it's oohs and ahs. Peafowl, well, they're very colourful, very noisy, not much sense, but good for display purposes. I hope that when I finish here, and I hope that isn't going to be for many years, that the old traditions will be kept up. I never tired of the place. Never, ever. I want to be here. You know, it's my place.
Reign Countess Spencer is best known as the daughter of novelist Dame Barbara Cartland and stepmother to the Princess of Wales. But her whole life has been wrapped up with architecture, both as an admired and campaigning conservationist at the Greater London Council, and more controversially as Chatelaine of Althorp, the ancestral home of the Spencers. Now she returns to an early love and fond memories of her grandmother, Polly Cartland.
first time I came to Cheltenham Spa was with Granny Cartland. It was just after the war ended, so it was a major outing. Granny drove at reckless speed, as she always did, talking 19 to the dozen. I've been afflicted by mumps, a distinctly antisocial disease, as we all know, and had been hastily packed off away from my two brothers. A couple of centuries ago, a good dose of spa waters would have been recommended as the wonder cure for my illness. Thankfully, Granny Cartland thought shopping more restorative, and so we came straight to the promenade. In the 1800s, the promenade was the focus of Cheltenham's social life, a place where friends were encountered, invitations offered, and even flirtations started, and where you might easily see Lord Byron or the great Duke of Wellington riding by on their way to take the waters. It all started in 1716, when a spring with salt deposits was discovered near the River Chelt. This water proved to have curative properties, and gradually visitors began to pay to take the waters. But it was the sickness of a king which really put Cheltenham on the map. In June 1788, George III fell ill with what he himself described as a pretty smart bilious attack. His physician recommended a course of the Cheltenham waters, and the royal party arrived for a 5-week visit. Soon Cheltenham was boasting of the unique efficacy of its waters as a remedy for neurasthenia, chronic gout, rheumatism, and gastrointestinal intoxication. Alas, for some people, the effects were simply too much.
Do pray, sir, make haste.
Oh, dear me, what a while he is about it.
Neighbour was so griping all my life. These are Chittenham fatters of very operative.
I'd better go upstairs and take a pot. I shall certainly go off at half-cock.
Oh dear. Oh, it's all over.
But one spring was not enough. More were discovered. Montpellier, Sherborne, Pittville, Cambrai, and Park Spas. There seemed no end to it. To accommodate the great influx of visitors, there was frenetic building activity. Montpellier Estate was one of the first areas to be built, a triumph of Regency property development. The buildings are very fine. Montpellier Walk is one of the star turns of Cheltenham. Caryatids, deriving from Greek mythology, stand guard over the shops. I'm really fascinated by these inscrutable figures who always remind me of the mysterious symbols in Italian paintings. My favourite street is Oxford Parade. At first glance, these seem rather ordinary artisan houses. What makes them extraordinary is the originality and lightness of the wrought iron on the window guards and canopies. They have a Chinese feel, and yet they are so light and insubstantial that I always long to turn them into parasols and see them whirled round on the stage by the chorus of Covent Garden in Turandot. All the same, I always feel upset that the glazing bars have been removed from the lower windows, just like a mouse with missing teeth. Cheltenham has more ornamental ironwork than anywhere else in the country. I find it lighter and prettier than even the famous lacework balconies of New Orleans and Charleston in the United States. These streets are a splendid chorus to the stars. And a true star is Pittville Pumpkin. One of the last of Cheltenham spas, and perhaps the most famous of all.
In the 1830s, you would approach Pitfield through exquisite gardens, wearing your elegant morning dress of sprig muslin on your way to take the waters at the pump room.
This dramatic colonnade of Ionic columns was copied from the Temple of Ilyssus. Visitors stood here to watch the boating on the lake while the band played the works of Strauss.
I will remember my darling husband, Johnny Spencer, waiting here for hours until the shadows became just right to take a photograph. He loved Cheltenham just as much as I do. This is truly a palace for the people, a triumphant temple to civic well-being.
The cupola is decorated with elaborate stucco rosettes derived from Greek paterae. I always want to gather them into a romantic bouquet.
I must tell you that I always remember Granny Cartland telling me about a very grand ball she came to here just at the turn of the century. She must have looked so beautiful in her gown, with her tiny waist. She was very small, and with her hair all piled up on her head, rather like the Gibson girls had it, just at that period, and wearing her diamond tiara. Now I'm going to drink a toast to my beloved Granny Cartland, who came to Cheltenham to take the waters, and she lived to be 97.
In next week's programme, back to the workhouse. How enticing is a past we'd all rather forget. Gone and almost forgotten, a genius architect whose life ended in Victorian melodrama. And actress Miriam Margolyes on a glorious childhood by the sea. Lovely. Until then, goodbye. Free one-foot fact sheet with opening times, history and travel details of the places featured in this week's programme, please send a stamped addressed envelope to 1 Foot in the Past, P.O. Box 11341, London W12 6DD. And we're now online with the 1 Foot website on the internet.
This summer, lose yourself in the world's greatest music festival. The BBC Proms 97, broadcast live from the Royal Albert Hall, only on BBC Television and Radio 3.